Hi, everyone, and welcome back to PR News Live. I'm Nicole Schumann, Senior Editor at PR News, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Just a reminder, if you have any questions today, just pop them into the comments and we'll get to them throughout the chat. Now, today, I'd like to welcome Matthew and Tammy Tsang. I should have asked before. Okay. Co-founders of And Humanity, an inclusive marketing agency. And a little bit of background on And Humanity. It's an agency built with diversity, inclusion, and most importantly, humanity at its core. And they live these principles as well as create authentic allyship with complex intersectional communities. They're looking to elevate underrepresented voices and promote diverse role models by channeling authentic brands and creating thoughtful content that deepens customer loyalty and influences positive social change. So welcome, Matthew and Tammy. We're really glad to have you guys here. We got to know And Humanity through its entry into the PR News Diversity Awards, which we're going to be announcing the winners of in a couple months, which is very exciting. So to let you guys know a little bit more about the Diversity Awards and why we're really going forward and promoting them quite a bit this year. Diversity and inclusion, as you know, continue to be at the forefront of necessary change in the PR industry. And PR News saw a responsibility to continue to recognize the noteworthy campaigns and communicators who are effectively navigating the transformed landscape. And it's important to see these changes with our own eyes and find inspiration in campaigns that many would like to emulate. So the Diversity Awards are a way of recognizing communicators from these multicultural backgrounds, PR pros from all genders and sexual orientations, and also those with disabilities. So we're hoping this program can serve as a platform for underrepresented communicators, and that by recognizing these talents, we can continue this conversation of diversity and inclusion and how to diversify PR and communications while holding the industry accountable. So really excited about these awards, and we're excited, we've gotten some amazing entries, and, I can't wait to see who won in the next couple months, and maybe we'll be hearing from you guys again as well. But before we talk a little bit more about And Humanity, we'd like to go over this week's article feature in PR News, and it's talking about fundamental communication building with trust. And you're hearing trust everywhere in the news right now. Especially with a new president in the U.S. government, just everything going on with the pandemic, vaccines, COVID-19. There's a lot of messaging coming at audiences, and sometimes they're not sure where to look or who to trust. So in the article that we wrote this week, Axios just released a study that since the inauguration, only about a week ago, America's trust in the federal government's handling of COVID is on the upswing. So that is a good sign. Edelman, however, released its 2021 Trust Barometer, showing business as one of the most trusted industries when it comes to communication. It actually bypassed the federal government and other societal foundations. So that's something to look at as well. A lot of people looking at businesses and the types of messaging they're putting out there right now. And another company, an example of a company trying to rebuild trust, is Twitter, which really has suffered quite a bit this year from disinformation, miscommunications, just groups coming together and inciting violence and those sorts of things. So Twitter has launched Birdwatch. It's a tool that allows users to participate in combating misinformation on the platform. Right now it's in its pilot infancy. It's only available in the US, but I think it's going to allow a lot of people to participate in, rebuilding that trust for Twitter. So Matthew and Tammy, sorry, I'm yammering on and on like you guys to talk today. What are your thoughts on organizations really working towards making trust a focus point this year, and how can they do it?
I think it's so important that trust is there. And I think a lot of times what we found is that now that we're moved into a generation where there's conversations with your audience instead of a one-way conversation, it's learning how to have those conversations in an authentic manner that will allow you to have a bit more of a relationship with your audience that is an opportunity for you to build trust. So one thing that we talk a lot about is building authentic relationships, and that's ensuring that you're actually having a dynamic conversation with your audience members. And our background is obviously in diversity, equity, inclusion, communications, marketing, what's really important is to ask your audience. We have a saying we often kind of live by, which is nothing about us without us. And oftentimes what that really means is allowing the audience to speak for themselves and not speaking on behalf of the audience. And being a business, you have such big responsibilities around that to make sure that you're not speaking on behalf of them, but utilizing your platform as an opportunity for them to speak.
Matthew, any comments on trust and what organizations can work on and look at?
It's funny that trust, I was reading the article as well, and trust is something that is a focus this year, when if you think about it, this is something that brands should be doing all the time, but it really goes to show how trends kind of, I guess, change how organization thinks, and a lot of things that are put on the back burner or not put as a focus come into focus just because of what's happening. So everything is kind of happening more reactively now. So I found it interesting in terms of that being a focus now in this day and age, when I guess as brand strategists or even as anyone in this industry, that should be something you're doing all the time, regardless. So, but back to the question, I guess about trust. I think that what Twitter is doing with the Birdwatch tool, that's great. It's giving the voice and power, like Tammy says, to the people to try to combat that. So I think that's kind of a good first step. But I do think that it's quite a long ways to go for a lot of organizations in terms of not just rebuilding trust, but putting that as a core part of what they do. Rather than maybe this is the trend for 2021 because of what's happened in 2020. So holding brands accountable as well.
Right. Yeah. Like you were saying, trust should never be, it should always be something that's a cornerstone of the communications strategy that you're going for. It shouldn't be just like a hot new thing that you want to try out. But I really did like what Tammy had to say about, reaching out to your audience and talking to them and finding out what their needs are, and bringing them in as part of it. I think creating that connection is a really important part of what a lot of organizations are trying to do here. And, I think especially with COVID, and you guys live in Canada, I'm not sure how the difference is with the, federal government communications there, but I think through a lot of 2020, a lot of people just thought they were just being talked at, rather than being heard and listened to. And, because a lot of people were having very different experiences than, what was being communicated from the federal government. So I think in that aspect, they have a bit of work to do up there, in terms of reconnecting with the public. So, but yeah, so, and moving on, thank you for commenting on that. Always curious to hear, what creatives and people, that are communicators are, their own personal impacts with trust and what they're looking for. But I'd like to talk with you guys now a bit about your agency and Humanity and the work that you do and how you're trying to make a difference in the diversity and inclusion space. And Matthew, I was just hoping, you guys would like to tell the origin story of your agency. And I see you guys are both brother and sister. So wondering how that all works out and how this all came about.
Sorry, I was on mute. That's the quote of 2021 and 2020. Yes. In terms of how we came about, so Tam and I have co-run a full service, fully integrated agency for I'd say maybe 12 years now. I don't never know the exact year, so it had been a while, but I would say a couple of years ago, we started looking into this inclusive marketing and kind of merging the world of diversity, equity, inclusion and marketing, and how that would look. And what we were finding, because we wanted to do this quite authentically, was when we were talking to diversity, equity, inclusion experts, a lot of what their frameworks, their models, and the tools that they use were mainly for HR departments and more internal organizational work. So they didn't have too much in terms of tools, in terms of how that affects marketing and external communications, right? So a lot of the framework and everything that we built, from our process and from even our self-assessment tool that we have on our website, to the way we measure the brand inclusion framework, which hopefully we can chat about today, are all co-created and co-developed with diversity, equity, inclusion specialists. Myself and Tammy, being from an quote-unquote underrepresented community, didn't want to rely on the fact that we come from an underrepresented community to assume that, hey, we can speak for the rainbow community, or we can speak for people with disabilities, et cetera, like that. Unless you come from that community, like Tammy said, nothing about us without us, you can't really speak to that. So one of the challenges being from a marketing background, especially if you're a brand strategist, for example, part of a philosophy is, like I said, like Tammy said, nothing about us without us. And it makes it really difficult because you're used to, as a strategist, taking all the information from research and taking pride in the fact that I know how to motivate someone that is not like me to purchase something, to do something, etc. But this is flipping it on its head a little bit by giving the voice to those that you are targeting, right? So I won't go deep into the process that we have now, but the idea behind it is giving the power back to the people that are consuming the content, giving them the ability to create the content, giving them the ability to strategize and pinpoint. So a lot of this is a shock to the industry, but we've had the pleasure of being able to educate people on this process. Everything from companies like Arc'teryx, Post Capital here in here in Canada, and yeah, other organizations, some global, some more local, et cetera, like that, around this idea. So yeah, so everything that we tried to do was, like I said, more authentic. So really bringing in experts in this space, not relying on the fact that we're underrepresented, and also educating our team. Our team has gone through weekly diversity, equity, and inclusion training assignments and workshops, et cetera, like that. And we continue to do that. We have a new plan for 2021. We're considering bringing in multiple experts rather than having an in-house expert that we had before training us. So I think that we all have more work to do in this space, including ourselves. So really dedicating time for ourselves and the team to do that, as well as trying to educate others on this. Because when you're merging justice, equity, diversity, inclusion work and marketing, those two, from our knowledge, have never mixed in the past, or there has never been a real framework or a process to do that properly. So yeah, that's what we're trying to bring to the world and change. Hopefully it becomes normal after time. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. No, it's interesting because I feel like, say you have a brand like Coca-Cola or something like that. To just think that they can, you can't just market to one pool of people. They might look at it as, oh, well, we're marketing to, Coca-Cola drinkers. Maybe that's our audience. But really, there's a lot of different audiences within there, right? Depending on, and how you're messaging to people. Am I following that in the right way? I don't know. I'm not looking for Coke marketing.
Yeah. No, I think the default in terms of this industry, for lack of a better word, has always been, even the target, even the way we do research and everything from the beginning has always been defaulted to the white male cisgendered lens. It's just comfortable. Even myself growing up in this industry, you can say, has found my own comfort in that as well, because we've all grown up that way. So it's kind of unlearning, as you've probably heard in this space, unlearning everything we have, breaking it all down, and then rebuilding it to be actually more inclusive. And I'll let Tammy talk more about that process, but talking about what the definition of inclusive marketing is, because you touched on, it touches on a lot of people. So how do you possibly, if you talk about bullseye marketing, how do you possibly do that? But I'll let Tammy speak.
Oh, well, I think with the whole idea of having kind of that dominant cultural lens on things, it's how do you remove the bias in the process? And that's a question that's not simple. Because if you think about even a survey, most of the time when we see a survey and you're checking off, say, gender, it's male, female, other, right? And now you might see male, female, trans, other, and it's literally in order of the priority, the dominant culture, right?
Oh,
So
yeah, that makes
right, it's literally in that order. And so if we think about something that's maybe non-biased on that, just that one question alone, you might think of in alphabetical order, and it'd be like cisgender, female, male, transgender, maybe non-binary. Clearly not in alphabetical order, but you know what I mean, like off the top of my head. And then it would be select all that apply. Because then again, what you're doing is now not reinforcing the idea of a dominant culture or dominant lens. You're providing space for everybody to be equal and work towards the same kind of way of identifying yourself, right? So for example, being a female who's cisgendered, I would check cisgendered and then female as well. Just as a transgendered person who's maybe identifies as maybe non-binary and transgendered would go transgendered, non-binary, right? So that apply to all steps in the marketing process, from strategy, from the way you create your projects, and understanding that how to remove lens and bias from the entire process is kind of a starting point that you can look at. But like we always say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Yeah, one of the things when we were chatting with diversity, equity, inclusion experts on this work, and we come from the background of marketing too, which made it so tough, and why we realized how difficult this was, because everything we had learned about, we thought we were being fair with how we were running our processes and things like that, but coming from their side, they're like, no, look at this bias here, look at this bias here, even as simple as that thing. So it took a lot of unlearning to get to that point where you don't even realize, even coming, like I said, coming from an underrepresented, I don't even realize my own internalized racism that I have towards my own culture when I do this work. So yeah, it's been a journey for sure.
Yeah, no, definitely taking an outside look at the work that you're doing. I think that's amazing. That's a really great idea, and hopefully more organizations start doing that. One of the things that many audiences are looking at are now the brands and organizations this past year that made promises to promote diversity and inclusion, particularly after this summer's social justice protests in the United States. So now that some time has passed, people are looking to hold these brands accountable. And I know you guys utilize a brand inclusion framework to help measure inclusion, which I have not seen before. So would one of you like to explain how that works? I think that's really interesting, and I know our audience really is interested in measurement.
Yes, actually, the reason why we created this framework was because it didn't exist, at least not to our knowledge. And so when we spoke to DI experts, we asked if there was a framework that would apply, and everything was, as Matt said, measured it internally, or for organizational structure, or for individual intercultural sensitivity. So what we took was one of the most famous models. It's Dr. Bennett's developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. And that model is actually used worldwide. It's a very popular one in the DEI space. And what we did was actually take the framework and apply it to communications. And what it's done is allow us to then measure how inclusive an organization is, depending on the dimension. So whether that's, the BIPOC dimension, or it's people with disabilities, and to then get a better understanding of where the organization is on the curve. So it's a curve. And it's kind of like a mountain you're trying to climb up it, and you might fall sometimes and you might get up sometimes, but the idea is the goal is to become what we call more ethno-relative, higher up on the curve. And with each dimension you might be different, right? So how we actually do it is we plot where the organization is on the curve and where your audience is on the curve in that dimension, and then it's helping organizations to step up the curve slowly, one by one. You can't, as an organization, jump 2 steps up or whatnot. But the idea here is really to give organizations a sense of where they land. We have a self-assessment tool on our website that allows organizations to just self-identify where they are. Obviously, there's some caveats if you want it to be extremely accurate. But the idea here is then to know how to communicate, to build trust with those communities that maybe you don't have a lot of trust with, or continue building dynamic relationships with the community over time. So that's a framework that we've been able to adapt to really help businesses actually put numbers to it, because in our industry, no numbers doesn't really exist. So
yeah. And what are you mentioned the self-assessment tool? What's an example of one of the questions that an organization might need to answer when taking a look at that?
It's there's a foundational aspect of like whether or not your team reflects your audience, and if they are the ones that are making all the decisions and yet they don't reflect your audience, that might be one, and that's a difficult one, like given that a lot of businesses are new. Another one is just whether or not you've done advocacy work more as kind of a one-time thing. So you hear a lot of brands putting up kind of their support for the rainbow community on Pride Month, and they're all about it for Pride Month, and then it's tumbleweeds for 11 months of the year. So that's one of the questions as well. Is it authentic? Is it performative? We're trying to decipher kind of the work that's being done.
A lot of the questions that Tammy mentioned are not just marketing related questions, because as you know, that's obviously being PR news, that's how brands get called out. A lot of the time they externally communicate something, right? But they get called out because internally there are stories that leak about how they're not actually being inclusive. So we as an agency try to hold our clients accountable in terms of, hey, if this is where you're at on the curve, we use the curve to assess that as well. This is where you need to communicate, right? You're trying to communicate 1 step up, not 10 steps up. Because if you communicate 10 steps up, then you're going to get called out because nobody's going to believe that, right? So there's a quote that as we were doing this work that really stuck with us in speaking to brands, and that quote is that it's not an expectation to be there anytime soon, but it is an expectation to start. Mm-hmm. And the idea behind that is that brands are jumping a lot of the time, as you saw with Blackout Tuesday and everything like that, jumping up the curve, trying to be like, this is what we're all about, et cetera, like that, with having no backing, nothing internally, nothing, no action plans to achieve that. And of course, they get called out. So it's because the pressure to make a stand sometimes. Obviously, neutrality is worse, but pressure to make a stand. So what it is trying to educate our clients on, okay, this is where you are, this is where you can be, this is where you should communicate based on that. So that's tough as well, because as a brand, you might feel these values, but at the same time, the internet is not always the safest place. So.
Yeah, and things do take time. We understand that, change is not going to happen overnight. Processes and in terms of, like you're saying, hiring different members for your teams, expanding different backgrounds. It takes time, and but it is also, part of the consumer's, responsibility to hold brands accountable nowadays. So that's definitely something that organizations need to prepare for. Especially when they're making such big statements. I know we only have a couple minutes left, but for either of you, what brands or organizations have you seen do you think are really making good choices in inclusion marketing, or do you have any good examples from work you've done? What seems to be working?
Actually, I wanted to talk about something that came out recently, the Doritos commercial that was about, I think the tagline at the end was Pride all year or something like that. And the reason why is it's great that I think they're doing something all year. I don't know the depth of it, but that will come out with time in terms of the depth of who created the work and everything like that. I don't know if you saw the Tinder India commercial that came out a couple of years ago, and people just dug into who created this commercial, et cetera, like that, who were the writers. And because I think there was a recent Harvard Business Review article or something like that said, be about it instead of just talking about it. And that's what consumers expect now. So they might see an emotional, really powerful, rich ad like the Doritos commercial, but you can bet that the consumers are going to do their homework and be like, hey, was someone, for example, the Doritos commercial, was someone from the rainbow community writing the script, directing it, et cetera, like that. And that's kind of what happened with the Mulan movie. As you know, people were like, oh, the director and the writer were not were white. Like, how can you? And then of course the story became like kind of like loosely based on the real tales that I even heard when I was young. So I think that will eventually reveal itself. But sorry, back to the Doritos commercial. I think it was really powerful. It was based on it seemed like it was based on a true story about a dad looking to connect with his son who did not openly admit that he was gay, but the dad could tell because of the way he interacted with his so-called friend, and didn't know how to approach him. So I think he went on Reddit to ask, how do I approach my son and tell him that I love him regardless, and I love him the way he is, etc. So that's what the commercial revealed. So I thought it was good because it told a real story. It elevated an underrepresented voice. One thing we didn't talk about is the definition of inclusive marketing is not to include everyone all the time. I've spoken to creative directors, like, if that's the case, then how are we supposed to like fit like, you know, even just one print ad is gonna, you know, we're gonna have to include everyone from a plethora, and that's not what inclusive marketing is. Inclusive marketing is being purposeful about who you're including and purposeful about who you're excluding, and trying to focus on elevating underrepresented voices. So that Doritos commercial, of course, elevated an underrepresented voice, one that you don't hear all the time. So I think I think the industry in general is going to move that way, because all the numbers showcase that populations are changing, and this is what consumers are demanding. It's just a matter of time. It's kind of like digital marketing. You know, I remember a decade ago, there were so many brands that fought with us about investing in it, and then now, like, you look at it. So I think it's just going to take time.
And I think the realization that brands are having is that when you're targeting, say, an underrepresented group, you're not just targeting, say, the rainbow community. You're actually targeting anybody who shares the value of being inclusive, being a global citizen, people who actually believe in this. I mean, that ad definitely resonated with me. I have much more respect for Doritos, like, and I don't necessarily fall in that underrepresented community. So that's something that I think brands are really beginning to realize.
Yeah, and that's interesting because, I mean, everybody loves Doritos. Doritos are delicious, but you even feel better when you know you're eating a snack food with a good message behind it. So, so that's great. We don't have a ton of time, but I did have one question that came in. So if you guys want to tackle this real quick, from a user that says, I was recently on a training course run by a marketing agency who were promoting the idea of agencies developing personas to understand and relate to audiences in the market. But I found that idea involves making a lot of assumptions unless one asks the audience to create their own personas for use by the agency. What are your thoughts about the personas approach?
What an excellent question, and you're actively questioning the bias and the lens, so great job with that. You know, traditionally in the agency world, that's a lot of what happens. I've been in rooms where they put up a photo of someone who's from an underrepresented community and says, what does this person need? What do they want? What's their motivation? And I'm sitting there looking around, I'm like, this is a very monocultural room that has no relationship with this. And they're like, oh, but, you know, data shows this and data shows this. I'm like, you know, I think that there are such complex intersectional identities within each geographic region and community. Like, even, for example, the rainbow community, if we're consulting with a community, we always go to the local rainbow community to ask about the nuances and the needs of that community. So be careful of all these ways of personifying people. Of course, it's easy. We've been taught in the marketing industry to really look at personas that way, but challenge it. Look at some of the assumptions that are made. Ask the questions that are part of it. Include people from that demographic in the team and the decision making. I think those are.
And one of the things that are you can say our most popular first step with clients is that we call it the inclusion audit process, which includes research, quantitative, qualitative research, and then defining your groups, your targets in an unbiased fashion, including, like Tammy used that example, surveys, and including bringing in people from underrepresented communities to audit things, to help with your strategy, because lo and behold, I mean, unsurprisingly, there are plenty of people from underrepresented communities that happen to be marketing strategists, brand strategists, and etc. Why are they not in the room? Like, they come with a lived experience that cannot be bought by research. And that's the thing. Remember, research as well, the way and the process in which it's done a lot of times has a white male cisgendered lens. So again, it's breaking down a lot of what we all learned and then questioning everything and relearning it. So yeah, that's a great question in terms of that. I think more and more people will have those questions as they're in the room and as they're defining personas, and they're like, oh, maybe this isn't the right way. But yeah, I think it'll take time.
Yeah, I love that idea of an audit. That's a really good idea. You know, instead of just creating, you know, this one type of person. I think that makes a lot of sense. This has been great. I wish we had more time because we could talk about this forever. And I know our audience is really interested in everything, you know, DEI. So you guys are doing some great work, and you know, I'm eager to see it continue. We've posted your link to your website as well in the comments in case anyone is interested in learning more about and humanity. So good work, and keep it going. I want to thank everybody for joining us on PR News Live this week. Thank you again to Matthew and Tammy for taking the time out today. I know you guys are busy. I also want to let everyone know about a great opportunity we have to showcase your outstanding innovative campaigns. We certainly know this year has been the year for digital, and really, you know, a lot of places have been able to stretch their creativity. So celebrate your work by entering our Digital PR Awards beginning on February 19th. We'll be opening a call for entries, and we'll be posting a link in the chat as well for anyone who's interested in learning more. So thank you all again for joining us today. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a special Valentine's themed show. One of our guests will be from OkCupid, among others. So we'll be chatting about relationships and dating and all that kind of fun stuff, especially during the pandemic. So hope you're all staying healthy and staying safe, and we'll see you next week. 2 weeks. Sorry. Bye.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.